Hi, welcome to the 8th lesson for Grammar with Clarity for Everyone. This lesson is going to focus on complex sentence structure, and then we're going to be talking about compound complex sentence structure. And this is going to make perfect sense to you because our last lesson we talked about compound sentence structure, which I'm sure you're going to do just fine with moving forward. We're layering in complex, and then it will make perfect sense to blend the two. So we're going to do those in one lesson together. All right, let's get started. We need orange, dark red, or the red and the dark blue colored pencils, and one sheet, probably 2 sheets of college ruled notebook paper, and a sharpened pencil. And we're going to go ahead and get started. All right, the first thing that I'd like you to do is go ahead and put a number 8 here for our 8th lesson, and then we're going to write complex sentences. Okay, so the first thing that we want to identify with complex sentences is that they are created with dependent clauses. Which we love because dependent clauses make our writing pretty interesting. Dependent clauses can force a very interesting complex sentence. So we're going to write this over here. They can force a very interesting complex sentence. So what is a complex sentence by definition? Well, by definition, it has to have one independent clause, and then it can have at least one or more, it can have a bunch of the dependent clauses. But if it has at least one independent and one dependent clause, it is considered complex sentence structure. So we're going to write that. We're going to come down a line, and we're going to do our asterisk, which indicates a definition point that we're making. Shift to a sharper pencil here. And we're going to say, by definition, a complex sentence has one independent clause and one or more dependent clauses. Okay, now we're going to color code what we have going on here before we move forward. So first of all, we want to go ahead and color code our dependent clause, little note here, okay? Because you aren't going to make a complex sentence without a dependent clause. Now, is a complex sentence only a dependent clause? Nope. You have to have an independent clause with it. They have to be joined together. Okay, so by definition, a complex sentence has one independent clause. We're going to turn this blue. Okay. And it has one or more than one. It has to have at least one dependent clause. Gosh, I tell you, sometimes when I go over that, it makes it look really messy. But okay, now let's talk about dependent clauses in relation to how can we make them and how can we make some really creative, engaging sentences when we develop these complex sentence structures. Okay, so we want to use something called a subordinating conjunction, okay? So we're going to come down here a couple of lines and we're going to write dependent clauses can be created with. Okay. Subordinating conjunctions at the beginning. Now, look at me throwing another new term your way, not to cause any anxiety for you. Don't worry about that. What we're going to do here is we're going to break down what this means. So we already know that the term conjunction, we've looked at this with coordinating conjunction, and we know that we can talk about those boy fans words, the but, or, yet, for, and, nor, and so. Those words, those are coordinating conjunctions. So they coordinate thoughts. But this is subordinating. Sub meaning below. Okay, so to subordinate means to make something go below in value, essentially, okay, to something else. So a subordinating conjunction is going to take our sentence, if we put it at the beginning, and it's going to make it require something else to work well. So it's subordinating it below something else, essentially. Okay, so we're gonna color code those orange. So we're going to go over subordinating conjunctions in orange. All right, now, I also would like you to do a squiggle, because when we do our sentence frames for complex sentence structure, where we're going to place a subordinating conjunction, we will use an orange squiggle. So it's good to just keep it all similar. Now, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to make a big list of subordinating conjunctions, because we want to have them front and center right there as we're trying to think about this type of sentence. So 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so I'd like you to skip a line here, and then I'd like you to make a box. We're going to indent just a little bit and go down 7 lines, okay? All right, now we are going to put 3 columns of subordinating conjunctions in here. We're not going to list all of the subordinating conjunctions, but we are going to list a lot of the commonly used ones. So here we go. We've got after, although, and as. We're going to go down. And then we have as long as, and that's 1 subordinating conjunction together. Because, before, even though, which is 1. Okay, the next column, start right here. If only, now that. I saw that my if only looks like 1 word, but it's not. Okay. Since, so that, though. Unless. Okay, now the third column, until, when, whenever. Where, wherever, while, whether. Now, this is not the weather, like as in, is it raining or is it sunny out? This is whether or not. This is a comparison word, okay? So these subordinating conjunctions, and now we're going to go ahead and draw ourselves an orange arrow coming off of that. These are pretty important words. We're also going to go over our box with orange. We want these to pop out and be really obviously their own special deal, okay? Now, the next thing I'm going to do, and actually the last thing we're going to do for this set of notes, we're going to come up with 3. There are many different sentence frames for complex sentence structure. I'm going to identify 3 of them, okay? So the first one is going to begin with a subordinating conjunction. And so I'm going to start the squiggle. I'm going to go squiggle, squiggle, squiggle. And then This is going to finish the dependent clause, and I'm going to put a really obvious comma right here, and then an independent clause, period. Okay, so let's color code now. So we start with a subordinating conjunction. That forces this to be a dependent clause. We have to have our comma there. And then this is going to be our independent clause. So let's go ahead and write what's happening here. So I'm going to write subordinating conjunction, dependent clause, independent clause. So this is a sentence frame that would create a complex sentence for us. Okay, the next sentence frame is going to be right here, and then a comma, and then another line, and then a comma, and then another line. Okay, this is a pretty commonly used one. So this one, we're going to begin the sentence with the first half of an independent clause. I'm going to put clause below so I don't run out of space. And we're going to finish that independent clause over here. So that's the second half of the independent clause. Well, then what do you suppose is going to be inserted right into the middle? A dependent clause. So this is an option that we have for a sentence frame. We can take an independent clause and we can literally just split it. Just take an independent clause and split it and throw a dependent clause in the middle, and we've created a more mature sentence. We've taken a simple sentence and we've made it a complex sentence. So this is a very cool thing to do. Okay, so we're going to underline that in red because that's our dependent clause. Let's go ahead and go over our commas in red as well. Okay, now remember this independent clause, this started the sentence, we cut it in half, it finished the sentence. Whoops, look at, I just snapped my blue. I'll have to go and sharpen that. These colored pencils do not like to have pressure, I'll tell you what. Okay, now the third sentence frame, and again, there are many options to create a complex sentence structure. So we're just doing 3. This is not the end all be all. But the third common frame is to go ahead and start with an independent clause and finish with a dependent clause. So we're starting with an independent clause. We're not separating it. And we're finishing the sentence with our dependent clause. So here we started with the dependent clause. We forced it with a subordinating conjunction, okay? We started with our dependent clause, we finished with our independent. Here we flipped it, okay? Sometimes we have to have a comma and sometimes we don't right here. It just really depends on some other factors, but sometimes you'll see one, sometimes you won't. Okay, so independent clause. And dependent clause. Okay, so now we're going to go into IXL and we're going to do some practice with complex sentence structure. Actually, no, I'm so sorry. No, we're not. We're going to do first some notes on compound complex sentence structure. I apologize. So let's go ahead and let's start another sheet. We won't go on the back of this one. We'll start a whole nother sheet and we'll title this compound complex sentences. And this is still lesson 8. Okay, so we're going to identify 3 sentence frames that will create compound complex sentence structure. These are not the only 3, these are just 3 commonly used ones. The first one is going to be where we're going to actually, because we have quite a bit to fit here, we're going to go all the way from the left edge to the right edge to make these fit so that you can see them in one line instead of multiple lines. I think that's visually easier. So we're going to have, whoops, one independent clause, a comma, a dependent clause, a comma, a coordinating conjunction, and an independent clause with a period. That's one. So now let's go ahead and label that. So this is an independent clause. And then this following the independent clause will be a dependent clause. And then we have our coordinating conjunction, and I'm just going to do a little drop down arrow and have you just remind yourself what that is. So you're going to write coordinating conjunction. And then let's just do a little teeny boy fans right here to remind you. I'll bet you will remember, but that's what's going to fit there. And then here we have an independent clause. Okay, so we are doing sentence frames for compound complex sentences. And I apologize if I end up repeating myself because I don't have the ability to rewind and see what I've already said. I have to just try to remember every time I pause. So I apologize if I'm restating myself. I'm pretty sure that I talked you through this. So now we're going to go ahead and color code this frame. All right, so we're going to start with our independent clause, which we know is blue. We're going to start the sentence with a standalone independent clause, and we're going to separate it with a comma from our dependent clause. And we're going to separate our dependent clause from our next independent clause with a comma as well. Now there's a coordinating conjunction happening right here, so we're going to go over that in orange. We're color coding both subordinating and coordinating conjunctions with orange, okay? All right, so that's one sentence frame for compound complex. The next one we're going to do starts with a subordinating conjunction. And of course, as we know, that creates our dependent clause. And then we have an independent clause. And then we finish off with another independent clause. This is going to, of course, be our coordinating conjunction. Which we won't identify because it's right here, but we will identify our subordinating conjunction. Now we've already taken notes on these, but I'm just going to put a few words right here in an open parentheses. These are words like while, as long as, because, and even though. When we start a sentence or a thought out with one of these words, we are forcing a dependent clause. Okay, and then we're going to separate that from the independent clause. And then we have another independent clause. Okay, let's do our color coding. So we're starting out with a dependent clause. We're actually starting out with a subordinating conjunction, which is forcing that dependent clause. And then we have two independent clauses. Let's go over our commas in nice big red. Okay, and then the last sentence frame we're going to do for compound complex starts out with an independent clause. And then we have another independent clause. Okay, so two of those. And then we have a dependent clause. Now this sentence structure, this sentence frame, typically when we have it with this sentence frame, what we're dealing with as this dependent clause, we're dealing with that type of dependent clause, which is called a relative clause. Do you remember that? A relative clause is just simply a subset of dependent clauses. And relative clauses, we can identify them because they begin with a relative pronoun. And what are those relative pronouns? Those are words such as that, which, who, whom, whose, okay? So these, they make a dependent clause. A lot of times you'll see them at the end. Sometimes you'll see a comma there and sometimes you won't. Okay, and we've got our independent clause, and of course our coordinating conjunction. Okay, that is it for notes. Now we're going to take our notes and we're going to apply them to several sample questions on IXL and see if we can pick out what is what. All right, the first example that we're looking at here is from at IXL 7th grade, Z.4. Now, all of the grades, no matter what the code is that we're looking at for them, all of them are going to be asking us the same thing, which is the sentence simple, compound, complex, or compound complex? So here, we're rolling all of the lessons we've learned so far about sentence structure into one practice. And this is one that's very easy to get stumped at. It takes a lot of analyzing. It takes really kind of understanding what you're looking at and breaking it down. It would be totally appropriate, in my opinion, to copy the sentence from IXL onto paper, do some color coding, match it up with your notes, and then determine what the correct answer is that way. That would make the most sense. Okay, so let's go ahead and start with this one. So it is since 1923, the United States Flag Code has provided advisory rules for displaying and handling the US flag. So what's happening here? Are we starting with a dependent clause? Well, since 1923 and then a comma, it kind of makes people think, oh, that's a dependent clause, which means maybe we're dealing with a complex sentence or a compound complex sentence. But if we're going to determine whether that is an independent, or excuse me, a dependent clause, we have to say, well, does it have a subject and a predicate? No, it doesn't. So this is definitely a phrase, and it's an introductory phrase. It's telling us when, okay? So since 1923, the United States Flag Code has provided advisory rules for displaying and handling the US flag. The next aspect of this sentence that could be tricky is the word and. The only reason why this is going to be tricky, and I know because so many students over the years have said, but wait, there's an and there. Shouldn't there be a comma in front of it? And doesn't that tell me that that's a compound sentence? No, because again, remember that the word and could be creating a compound sentence, or it could simply be listing two things, or it could be at the tail end of listing three or more things. So and has multiple jobs. Okay, so in this case, and is doing the job of simply listing, displaying, and handling. It's just saying there are two things that the United States Flag Code has provided rules for those two things. So with all of that in mind, well, what do we do? What do we say this is? Well, we've not met the criteria for complex because we don't have a dependent clause. We've not met the criteria for compound because we don't have two independent clauses. Then guess what? It's definitely not compound complex because that's even more advanced than either of those two. It has to be simple. So even though it's a long sentence with commas, with the word and, it doesn't matter. It's still a simple sentence. Okay, the next example we're going to look That is from the 10th grade, X.5 with the same title is the sentence simple, compound, complex, or compound, complex. Again, every grade level is going to have this set of questions all looped together or lumped together, I guess is the best word. All right, so first we're going to read the whole sentence and then we'll go back and look at what I did for the annotating that I did. Since it takes approximately 1,000 years for a used printer cartridge to decompose, recycling these plastic ink dispensers helps the environment. So the first thing I did is I said, wow, our sentence is starting out with the word since. And I know that the word since is a subordinating conjunction. So right off the bat, I'm thinking that is a dependent clause. So let's read the whole thing and see if it is. Since it takes approximately 1,000 years for a used printer cartridge to decompose, that definitely had a subject and a predicate. And I'm definitely left wondering, so then what happens since it takes approximately 1,000 years, right? So what happens? I'm left wondering what. That definitely fits the criteria for dependent clause. Now I'm going to look at the next sentence or the next aspect of this. Recycling these plastic ink dispensers helps the environment. That's a complete independent clause. That's a standalone sentence. So guess what? That is absolutely a complex sentence. And if we look at our sentence frames that we did, which one does this fit? Does it fit our first example, our second example, or our third example? I'll give you a second to look at your complex sentence notes that we just finished and see if you can determine which sentence frame this one fits into. Hey, if you picked the first one, you are correct. Good job. Okay, this next example, this one is a potentially tricky one, okay? And I'm gonna give you a clue on this one. This one, I want you to grab your notes for your compound complex sentence structure. This sentence is compound complex. Now, I also want to tell you which sentence frame it's going to be. If you look at your third sentence frame, the one we just recently finished, this is an example of that third sentence frame. Let's look at why, okay? It's going to start out with an independent clause, and then it's going to have a comma, and then a coordinating conjunction, and then another independent clause, and then a dependent clause, which is actually a relative clause. Now, in our sentence frame, we have a comma separating those last two clauses. This sentence does not. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. It really depends on what's happening in this sentence. So just don't get confused by that, okay? If you can say, wait a minute, their vision later degenerates. That's a complete thought. Their vision later degenerates. Okay, that's an independent clause. And then I look at what's coming next. When skin grows over their eyes, that gives me more interesting information, but it doesn't have to be there, right? So this is called a relative clause, and it's adding information. Okay, whether it has a comma separating it or not doesn't matter. So now let's go to the very beginning of this, okay? Mexican tetras or blind cave fish can see at birth. What's going on here with this comma or blind cave fish? I chose this example again because this is another opportunity for students to go, wait a second, I think or is one of those words that joins two sentences to make a compound sentence, and you are correct, but not in this case. Or is used to list something, and in fact, what it's doing in this case is it's renaming Mexican tetras, which we learned a lesson or two ago is called an appositive. So we're renaming a Mexican tetra or clarifying it. So that's all that's doing. That is simply a phrase, renaming. It's not a clause, so we don't need to worry about that. So Mexican tetras or blind cave fish can see at birth. That is one independent clause. Now you see a comma but, so the coordinating conjunction in the comma, okay? And then you skip over that and you look to see, does the next section work as an independent clause? And it does. And then what's happening? Well, that's a dependent clause and it's relative. So we have a compound sentence first, and then we have a dependent clause being added, which turns it into a compound complex sentence because we have more than one thing happening here. We have compound plus we have complex, okay? Okay. Oh, wait, hold on, I gotta share. All right, so let's look at this one. So this one I'm going to tell you right off the bat, this is a compound complex sentence structure. So look at those notes and let's see if we can determine which pattern we are using. Oh, do you know what I forgot to do? I forgot to annotate the as a subordinating conjunction. If you looked at that and you thought, oh, as is a subordinating conjunction, good for you. I forgot to put a little orange star over that, or because I can't do a squiggle below it, so I was doing a star. Okay, so here, so this is going to then be our second sentence frame, an example of that. As cold weather approaches, that is our dependent clause forced by the subordinating conjunction, as, comma, now we have an independent clause. You must protect your water pipes against freezing. Now we have a comma and the coordinating conjunction or, and then we finish with another independent clause. They can rupture and cause significant damage to your home. So these two independent clauses with the comma and the or create a compound sentence. But because we started this sentence with as cold weather approaches, and that is a dependent clause, we've now upped the ante and we've made the best sentence, the compound complex sentence. And if you notice, okay, let's think about this for a second. Here's something that I haven't done that I typically do. Let's pick the base bit of information from this sentence. The base bit of information is, you must protect your water pipes against freezing, period. That is the thought that needs to get out here, right? Would you say that's the most important aspect? Yeah, okay, but when we add that dependent clause that lets the reader know when you have to do this task, and then we add the independent clause after it that lets the reader know what could happen if you don't, we've now created a really very mature bit of information. We always want to be thinking more. What else can I say? Okay, so one of the things that I see, I mean, I have been working with students for a very long time, and I will tell you that the number one thing that teachers want to see, and this is across the board in all subjects, they want to see developed thought. They want to see mature sentence structure. And when I say mature sentence structure, I do not mean simple sentences. I mean compound, complex, and compound complex sentence structure, varied with some simple ones thrown in there, because then you're really expressing what you're trying to say with all of the additional information, and you're getting as much information out as you can. So I want you to start thinking this way, and I want you to start pushing yourself to be writing in a more advanced way. I don't care if you're in 7th grade or 12th grade, you should be doing this now. Okay, here is the path for you to go to for IXL depending on your grade level. And I'd like you to do 15 correct. I would say that if you do 15 correct, you will have had an opportunity to identify all of the different types of sentences. If you get through 15 correct and you're like, wow, I don't think I've seen a complex sentence yet, or I haven't seen a compound complex yet, could you keep going a few more until you do? I'd like you to make sure you practice all of them with a minimum of 15 correct. Okay, so if you're in 7th grade, you're going to go to Z4. 8th grade will go to AA4. 9th grade will go to X5. 10th grade will go to X5. 11th grade will go to U5, and 12th grade will go to U5. You guys are doing great. This is not easy stuff. It is tricky, and I'm going to tell you that even as an adult and as a teacher and somebody who feels pretty darn confident with these concepts, I will still sometimes answer a question on IXL wrong, and I'll go, how did I get that wrong? That doesn't make sense. I know what I'm talking about. I got that correct. It must be wrong. But then, do you know what I do? I go through the explanation, because when you get something wrong, IXL is going to tell you what you got wrong. It's going to tell you what the correct answer is, and it's going to tell you what you answered, and then it's going to give you a little lesson, which you might feel a little overwhelmed by. But at least read the top part and then scroll down to the very bottom part. At the very bottom part of their explanation is very helpful, because it will actually say, here is exactly for this question how it's broken down. So it's going to break each piece down for you and make it really understandable. So please, if you get one wrong, don't just go, oh, well, and move forward. Take that extra time and use that as a learning opportunity. Don't feel frustrated. Say, okay, I didn't get it. Well, that's okay. I'm going to figure out why I didn't get it. I'm going to let this system tell me why I didn't get it. And this is one of the things I love about IXL, is that it gives a beautiful explanation for students as to where they went wrong. And then you see the next one come up and you're like, oh no, I'm not going to get tricked by that. I know what's coming. Good luck to you. I'm very proud of you for hanging in there through all of these lessons so far. Coming up next, you can expect an entire series on rules for using commas. So these lessons are going to be brief. The comma rules, we might have 10 minutes of notes, so maybe 15 max. So moving forward, these are going to be very brief. After that, we'll be talking about semicolon rules, and then colon rules, and then punctuating dialogue. And we're going to finish this curriculum out with when do we use apostrophes in contraction, or well, using apostrophes in contractions, and using apostrophes to show possessiveness, which is so commonly confused even by adults. That's how we're going to finish this. So you did great. Hang in there. I am excited if you continue learning from these.